Hey guys, welcome back to Crawl TV. On this episode, we're going to be installing a Nitro rear axle shaft on our Jeep. So like most of our Jeep builds, we decided what we were going to replace next by breaking something. And in this case, we bent the flange on our factory rear axle shaft. So we wanted to find a rear axle that would work for us to install in the driveway without having to take it to a shop to have the studs pressed in and the bearings pressed on. The Nitro 32 spline rear axle shaft that we have here is fully pre-assembled. This is a chromoly shaft with new Timken bearings, new retainer plates, and new tone rings already on it. It comes with a 5x5 and a 5x5.5 bolt pattern here. Of course, our wheels are 5x5, and this is a 5x5.5 that it has. So we are going to move these studs one over. These 19mm bolts just thread right out, and we'll change this from the 5.5 bolt pattern to the 5x5 bolt pattern, and we'll just move every bolt over one. With that bolt pattern swapped, we'll start taking the brakes off so we can get that axle pulled out of there. So if you're just swapping the axle shaft, you can actually pull the caliper and bracket off from the two 18mm bolts on the back side. But since this flange was bent for a while, it actually ground up our brakes pretty bad, so we're going to be replacing the pads and rotors as we go along. So we're going to start with these caliper slide pin bolts.
If you're in the same boat as us and are replacing the rear axle due to trail damage or another unexpected incursion, make sure to inspect your brakes. There's a good chance you'll need to replace the pads and rotors if the issue has gone uncorrected for some time. Our first indication of damage was a brake squeal. If you do need to replace the pads and rotors, we have a full install video of that process on our channel. If not, grab your 18mm and you're ready to pull the whole assembly off.
Okay, now we're going to pull the rotor off. Make sure your e-brake is off. It'll make it a lot easier to get that thing out of there. So there's just a slight bend in the flange right here. It's kind of hard to see with the naked eye, but I'll show you what it looks like with just using my ratchet as kind of a spacer. You can see I can just stick it right in and out freely, but if I spin this, it gets tighter and then loose again and then tight again to where this is wedged in there, and expand that out to the whole length of the wheel and tire, and that's how we get that big wobble in the back wheel and the brake squeal. It's because of that variance there. Now we're going to disconnect our rear wheel speed sensor wire here. There's a small red tab you just have to pop out. Oh, I'm not going to work with my thumb, and I removed the tab entirely with a wrench. Whoops, maybe I can get that back in. But now you just push a little pressure with your finger where the red tab was, and wiggle that right off. Now we're going to pull the wheel speed sensor out. It's 8mm, and they're delicate little parts, so be careful with them. We'll just pull this out, get that out of the way. Now we just have to remove the e-brake here, and to do that, it's on a spring with a small flange, and you just have to pull it and pop it out. Like that. And then you can pull the cable out a little bit and get some slack on it, and then that just pops right out of that hole. Now we have to remove the 4 nuts that hold the retainer plate in place, and we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these are 18mm. Get a little leverage on this. There we go. And the lower one here. Now we're ready to hook the axle puller and slide hammer up to the flange here to get that whole axle shaft out. But before we do, we've got some paper towels laid down and a handful of paper towels to shove into that axle tube to keep any fluid from continuing to roll out. I rented these tools from O'Reilly. They're universal, really easy to set up. You just hook it up to 3 of your wheel studs here, thread on some lug nuts, and then you're ready to give it a tug and pull that shaft out. Basically, you're just breaking the splines free from inside the diff there and pulling out the bearing at the end of the axle tube. So it doesn't need a ton of pressure. Just give it a good jar. Now we've still got this bearing race in here, and we're going to want to get that pulled out. Not a ton of gear oil came out when we pulled that shaft out because this side of the vehicle is a little bit higher uphill right now, and we did anticipate for that. Now to get this race out, because it is kind of stuck in there, and it's come out far enough, we don't need a bearing puller to get that out. So I'm just going to take a big pair of channel locks and grab it by the edges, and it pulled right out. Now I'm just going to spray everything down with some brake cleaner just to clean it all up before we put that new axle in. So that'll clean up inside where the bearing is going to seat right here, and it'll clean up all the mating surfaces for our retaining plate just so that we get a nice snug fit around the end of this tube. Now you can see on the retainer plate, it's not the same on all 4 sides. 2 of the sides have a big divot in them, and that is so that it can fit around the hole where your wheel speed sensor mounts into the axle flange here. So we're going to make sure we line those up when we install the axle. Now we can throw this new axle shaft in. We're going to pull this rag out, make sure it's nice and clean, and this can go right in. And you kind of have to rock it up like that to shove it into place. So I'm going to put some thread locker compound on these bolts now. If you can see, there's already
there's some blue.
There's already some blue on there.
This is take 2. I started the camera and realized after the video stopped.
Yeah, so we only got like 2 seconds of footage there, so
It wasn't my fault.
we're showing you guys how to do it again.
No, I really want that clear though. It's not my fault.
So we'll put these 2 nuts on the back side here, and then it'll be the same for the 2 on the forward side of the axle. So now we're going to tighten these 4 nuts down, but kind of like putting a wheel on, you want to do it in a cross pattern so that you don't get one side too tight. So when this retainer plate sets, it's nice and even. So we'll start with this top one and then kind of cross down to the lower one on the other side, and then the lower one on this side, and then the upper one on this side, and back and forth until that thing is nice and snug. So those 4 nuts on the flange are going to tighten down to 45 foot-pounds. And with the current tools that we have, we can only reach one of those nuts. So, as you guys know, Jeep parts are expensive. Jeep tools is expensiver. And because we've got a 3/8 adapter on an 18 short socket, we're just going to get that one tightened down, and then we're going to take the other 3 to Guten tight, which, if you guys don't know, is just German for as tight as we can get it without a torque wrench. So here's the one that we can reach. Just kind of wiggle it into place there, and then this will come up to 45 foot-pounds, which I think I've already got them all set to that. Okay. Now we'll throw a little bit of thread locker on our wheel speed sensor.
Maybe you should stop saying a little bit.
I know, I cut that hole so big on the tip of it that everything comes out just gushing. We'll throw this into place now. Okay. If you guys saw earlier, this little red tab came out on us. If that happens to you, no worries. Just push it back into place right there. And then go ahead and install this thing. There we go. And now that's snapped and locked in place. Now we'll reattach the e-brake line here. And to do that, once again, we're gonna pull it, get some slack in this line, and then pop this right into that eyelet. And once you do that, pull this spring tight, wrap that cable under that hole, and then that snaps in place. And we'll use a lug nut. Wow. Just to keep, it's really cold out here.
It's getting colder, yeah.
This rotor from falling off. All right.
We created our brake install video after noticing the squeal mentioned earlier. It took Jarrett following me home from work in the Grand Cherokee as I drove the Wrangler for him to notice the rear passenger wheel wobbling and ultimately diagnose the issue as an axle problem. It's an easy thing to miss, so if you've recently replaced your brakes and still hear that squeal, we definitely recommend examining your axle. Again, if you're upgrading the axle before any issues arise, you can simply reattach the entire assembly using the 18mm caliper bracket bolts.
Now the last step that we're going to do prior to throwing the wheels and tires back on is throw some anti-seize on these lug studs. And the reason that we're going to do that is because you want to be very careful not to cross-thread these on. If you do, by any chance, cross-thread a lug nut onto one of these studs, you're going to have to pull the whole axle shaft back off to replace the stud because they are threaded in. Now with that said, a pre-assembled axle shaft is still the only way that we would go with this. The Nitro Gear shafts make it really, really easy to install in the driveway without having a shop and a press and everything at hand. So anybody can do it themselves just like we did today. But we'll make sure to put this on all 10 lug studs that we're doing in the rear, and then that's it. We're all done. So we just finished up with the driver's side of the Jeep. We did the exact same thing, installing our new axle shaft, and this is actually the axle shaft that we pulled out of the driver's side. It's the unbent one, but we decided after getting the wheels and tires on that we were going to bring it in here where it's a little bit warmer to talk to you more about why we chose Nitro Gear and Axle to replace our shafts. So if you guys haven't examined an axle shaft before, this is basically what we're working with. Right here we have a 32.5-inch, 32 spline, 2007 and up Dana 44 Rubicon rear axle shaft. This is the one that was pulled out of the driver's side again, so it's perfectly straight. But the basic anatomy of it is you have your wheel studs pressed in here, and they're pressed into your flange. You've got a tone ring, which is what your wheel speed sensor reads from. A retainer plate, which is where those 4 nuts that we were tightening attached to. You've got an oil seal. And then you've got a bearing. The bearing consists of the bearing rollers and the race. And then you've got the shaft here. And as you go down the shaft, you can feel that it gets thinner as you get toward the center where the splines are. And these are the splines themselves at the end of the shaft. So like we said, this is our factory shaft. The shafts that we installed in the Jeep are the Nitro Gear and Axle chromoly, aka chromium alloy molybdenum shafts. And they're 40 to 50% stronger, and after the splines are cut in the end of them, they're heat treated for added strength. If you can see the color difference here in this shaft, it's about that much that actually fits into our Eaton E-locker with the 32 spline. If you're running a regular Sport or Sahara and haven't added a locker, this part will fit into your Spider gears as a 30 spline. But essentially, this is how much of your shaft that is actually having torque added to it. So if you can imagine, on a regular Jeep with a 30-inch tire, which was what Jeep made from the factory, putting that much torque on a small wheel like that is just fine with these shafts. They can hold up to that kind of pressure, but when you put a 37-inch tire on a factory shaft, you're putting quite a bit of added torque right here, and the factory shafts just don't have the tensile strength to hold up to that. And what can likely happen is that you can brake right here at this line and then leave this part broken inside of your differential, which is a much bigger issue to confront than having a twisted chromoly shaft, because chromoly is more likely to bend than break, which actually is a huge added benefit, because if you have to change one out on the trail, you want to pull the thing out in one piece. The other added benefit that we have is on the other end of the shaft, the Nitro gear and axle flanges are much thicker than the OEM shafts, so that would have solved all of our problems. If we were running a chromoly axle shaft to begin with, we likely wouldn't be making this video at all.
That's actually incredible that Nitro can make a kit where the flange is thicker than the OEM shaft.
Is that what I said?
Yes.
Do we need to reshoot this?
No, I think everybody gets it.
All right, so we've established that the factory shafts are not as good as the chromoly shafts. So we got the chromoly shaft, but why Nitro? We did a lot of research into what kit to purchase prior to getting the one that we had, and one of the biggest factors for us was pre-assembled. A lot of the kits that you purchase don't come with all the necessary parts, and you have to take them to a machine shop once you get them to get it all put together. Now the retainer plate and the studs on most of these kits don't actually come with the kits. You'll just get things like the tone ring and the bearing and stuff, but then you have to get all that stuff pressed in and get all of the wheel studs pressed into the flange prior to installing it. And a normal machine shop probably costs around $50 or so. We don't know because we didn't have to go to a machine shop. Prior to taking it to the machine shop, you're also going to have to cut the bearing off of this because it is pressed on so that you can get this retainer plate off. And that's going to destroy this fully assembled axle shaft that you have. And if you plan on keeping it like we are to use as a trail spare, it's a total loss, because if we ever do in the future twist the splines or bend a flange, which we highly doubt, but we Jeep with a lot of people that may possibly have that problem, we won't have anything to replace it with because this axle shaft has to be destroyed in order to save the parts on it. Now the cost for our 32 spline rear axle shaft kit, both left and right side, was $495. But if you take it to a shop, being a prior shop manager myself, I can tell you that the average labor cost is going to be right around $100 an hour plus whatever the shop's markup is on the part. So this was an easy choice for us. We didn't have to take it anywhere. It goes right into the Jeep, right here in our driveway. We spend no money other than food and beer. So we save big time by doing this ourselves, and a lot of you guys that watch are do-it-yourselfers as well. So this is a really, really easy choice for you. If you guys are interested in purchasing this kit, we'll link to Nitro gear and axle as well as just differentials down below. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to comment or contact us on any of our social media, as well as our website, www.crawltv.com. And we appreciate you watching this with us. Stay tuned for next time, and thanks for watching Crawl TV. That's why I grabbed both sizes. I couldn't remember.
You should really watch your brake video.
Oh, ouch. Oh my God.